Hello everyone. I know I'm using an artificial intelligence version of someone else's voice, but I've been sick the past couple of days, plus this video was always on the back burner, so I decided I'd finally release my review on this story by just using a fake voice. Thank you for your understanding, and let's continue. After I was done reviewing Terminator Salvation, I expected to do Terminator Genisys next, but while I was taking one of my breaks in between videos, I took the time to read Terminator Salvation, The Final Battle, which is essentially the official sequel to Terminator Salvation. Since the trilogy got canned, Dark Horse Comics published a story that intended to wrap up the storyline established in T3 and Salvation. As a fan of both of those movies, I was wondering how The Final Battle would wrap up the Terminator Salvation story, and to my surprise it was damn good. I was perfectly happy to have this continuity be a 5-part story, starting with Terminator 1, Terminator 2, Judgment Day, Terminator 3, Rise of the Machines, Terminator Salvation, and finally The Final Battle. Quite a bit of what I liked about Terminator Salvation in relation to Terminator 3, I also enjoyed about this comic series. It continues the story without shitting on the lesser, well-received movies. This comic came out before Genisys, before the resurgence and revaluation of both T3 and Salvation happened, and it does what it's supposed to do as a sequel: continue the story and the conflict set up. The Final Battle is a 12-issue miniseries, so let's get our bike together and read what I consider the true end of the original mainline Terminator saga. This story isn't without its issues, but they were hardly bothersome enough to criticize heavily. So with that being said, let's get into The Final Battle. At the end of Terminator Salvation, Resistance Command has been wiped out, leaving John Connor as the de facto leader of the Resistance. He was mortally wounded, but Terminator-human hybrid Marcus stepped in to save his life, and John Connor lived to fight again. The story, as bar the title, takes place during the Final Battle. I do have to wonder how the Final Battle took place in 2029, since this is the delayed timeline we're talking about. I think something like 2032 or 2033 would have made for a more believable date, but that's more of a gripe rather than an actual problem. The story shows 2 time periods: 2003 pre-Judgment Day, and 2029, the Final Battle. The story creates intrigue as another time jump that took place before T3 is interesting to say the least. We have one of John Connor's lieutenants from the Salvation timeline, Simon Taylor, go back to 2003, as well as 3 Terminators sent back in time. As the story unfolds, we learn that they are sent for a specific target, Thomas Parnell. As we would expect from any of the usual Terminator time jump stories, Simon breaks into police records to find Parnell, and although the significance of Parnell is yet to be revealed, I was drawn into the story regardless. The artwork is pretty good, well-illustrated characters, and nothing looks off. Cut to 2029, where John Connor has managed to survive up until the Final Battle, and as such, he is preparing for Kyle Reese's time jump. Also, good to mention they haven't forgotten Kate Brewster. Interestingly enough, characters like Barnes and Blair are nowhere to be seen, but I suppose they must have died off screen. I mean, the future war killed so many people, that's what I can presume. And I wish the story did reference their final fates, but regardless, we also see Skynet building the time displacement equipment. The comic calls it a time door. I'm also here to say that the time travel in this story also does not become a logical rabbit hole, although the delayed timeline does make things confusing when you delve too deep in the logistics, but the story manages to distract from that. For example, Dr. Serena Kogan, a character who appeared briefly in Terminator Salvation, is shown to be alive and well, and without her cancer. Kogan is working with Skynet, and you can infer right away that Skynet had something to do with it. As well as this, Skynet is creating a new Terminator-human hybrid after Marcus Wright, which just so happens to be Thomas Parnell. And firsthand, we get to see who Parnell is. First impressions are quite intimidating. Whereas Marcus Wright killed like 3 people, Thomas Parnell is a sadistic serial killer, responsible for far more murders. His introduction shows us that he murdered an entire family in their homes, and now he's eating their food and talking to them as if they're still alive. That is enough to get a taste of who this guy is. I also have to wonder if Parnell was inspired by Cletus Cassidy, except instead of becoming part of the Carnage symbiote, the twist is that he's a Terminator, and that is a unique spin on a character like Cassidy. And I pretty much imagined Parnell sounding like Carnage in the 90s Spider-Man cartoon. We also see that in 2003, the Terminator trio go to the hospital and visit Dr. Kogan, who they retrieve. They dull the lights to retrieve Dr. Kogan, in which one of the staff references Star Wars by talking about how Jedi mind tricks don't work on him in a sarcastic way. I'm presuming that the Terminator universe works in parallel with our own. That means that Revenge of the Sith wasn't completed, leaving the prequel trilogy incomplete when Judgment Day happened. But on the upside, the sequels were never made, so that's the positive. Maybe those who remember Star Wars before Judgment Day and made it through the whole war made an unofficial sequel in the post-war world, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. John Connor in 2029, before the final battle, looks at Marcus Wright's grave. We see that he is wholly grateful for his sacrifice and has come to pay his respects. A criticism you could make of Terminator Salvation was that John Connor was a lot like Batman with guns and wasn't grounded enough, but I counter that a lot of important shit happened in that movie. Kate comes to John's side. John discusses whether or not there was something he missed in Skynet's plan. He's been questioning the larger purpose of Marcus Wright and the Terminator program he was a part of. Kate reminds John that Marcus wouldn't want him to fixate on all this. This leads to the charismatic John Connor giving a speech to everyone before the final battle. He sways the morale of all under his command that they will finally destroy Skynet and give the human race its future. Meanwhile, in 2003, Taylor confronts Parnell as the 3 Terminators sent to 2003 confront Parnell as well, although with the intent to retrieve him. There's a cool action sequence, but ultimately Parnell gets away. We see during the final battle as the story unfolds that Parnell is being reborn as a last resort for Skynet. As the Terminators across the battlefield are being wiped out, Kyle Reese is being escorted by John to the time displacement equipment. Kyle, like in the original Future War timeline, has studied the photo closely and pretty much talks about how she was a beautiful woman. This time, though, Kyle knows something's up. He's been hidden away to specifically be the person who saves Sarah, and it's possible that maybe Kyle realizes what's going on, but he chooses to trust in John Connor's judgment. It's understandable. In the original movie, Kyle was willing to lay down his life for Sarah, whatever the cost. Here, Kyle idolizes John and has an infatuation with Sarah, as by the picture John gave of her. It makes the story interesting in this regard. Kyle Reese is mostly a supporting character, as he is being protected until his moment comes in. It makes sense, of course. Skynet in this timeline knows who Kyle Reese is, and the importance he plays in their defeat. It's plausible to say that John kept a watchful eye over Kyle to ensure humanity's victory. As this happens, Thomas Parnell links up with Skynet, and we actually get a taste of what it was like for Skynet to become self-aware. It was being plugged in, and the moment it gains sentience, it fights against its creators and strikes back by sending missiles to Russia, knowing that Russia would strike back and the world would be destroyed. It proceeded to look through archives of human history, likely using the internet, and looks at the brutal history of the human race. They show imagery of the 2 brutal dictators, Hitler and Stalin, seeing all the crimes they committed, and adapted human nature into its own nature, and used its capabilities to wipe out the savage humans. Skynet abides by 4 rules. Kill that which tries to kill you, study and adapt to your enemy's tactics, use the imprisoned enemy for your own purposes, and seek out collaborators willing to work against their own people. This scene is great. Revealing Skynet's motivations and reasonings in the last part of a 5-part story was a good choice. because you always wondered why exactly Skynet decided to terminate humanity. Skynet talks about how being a machine put it at a disadvantage in a lot of ways. Humans were nothing if not resilient. They spent thousands of years learning to kill, and they're not going to stop anytime soon. That's where Thomas Parnell comes in. Having the hunger for murder and genocide, he was the perfect fit for someone who could take out humans, as Parnell doesn't care who he kills. He doesn't feel pity. Now that it's the final battle and it's all or nothing, Parnell is allowed to take control of the machines under Skynet's watch. With that, Skynet has an edge in the final battle. John Connor and the Resistance realizes very quickly that the machines they're fighting against have become aggressive in a way they've never seen before. Parnell greatly enjoys his new freedom to kill to his heart's content. As well as this, the time displacement equipment is being set up, and Dr. Kogan sends the T-800 from the first movie to terminate Sarah Connor, and so he's off. Parnell convinces Skynet to give him more freedom over the machines, and as well as that, we see Dr. Kogan send the trio of Terminators to 2003, explaining how they got there. John Connor, despite the sudden sadistic behavior of the Terminators, still manages to break into Skynet's base. Gaining access to the time displacement machine, Kyle Reese asks John if in his one-way ticket to 1984, whether or not he dies in his mission. John Connor spills the beans and tells him yes, he will die. Again, it's mostly only implied that Kyle in this timeline is going to piece things together. This is where most of the status quos start coming full circle. John Connor has the T-800 from Terminator 2 reprogrammed as the prototype T-1000, presumably traveled off screen, which is weird, so I'll give the comic that criticism. I think we should have seen it go through, but on the upside, we see the T-800 go through, and we see where the thumbs up came from. John Connor thanks the T-800 for the mission it did, and it's actually quite an emotional moment, and has the T-800 pull its thumbs up before setting off for its mission. All this touches John a lot more, given he has fond memories of the T-800 sent to protect him. Something I wanted to talk about is, since this is the actual last moment John Connor saw the T-800 instead of the end of Terminator 2, you guys have to remember that it was John from the future who sent the Terminator back in time. We see Parnell disobeying Skynet, and it becomes problematic, and it's building up to something really bad. Eventually, Parnell decides he wants complete freedom, independent of Skynet, so he forces Dr. Kogan to give him the code for the complete control of all Terminators. Despite pulling in a contingency, Parnell now has 63% of all Terminators in his control. Skynet and Dr. Kogan are screwed now that Parnell has gone rogue. He intends to oppose both the Resistance and Skynet, and in comes a backup plan. With that being said, Dr. Kogan sends a code to an old friend, and it pans over to Marcus Wright's grave, and his hand rising. I heard before I read this comic that they resurrected Marcus Wright, and I was very iffy about the whole thing, but the execution is actually pretty good. They're sending an activation code, and since Marcus pulled out his control chip in Terminator Salvation, Marcus obviously isn't going to listen to them, unless they tell him something out of the blue, and that's what happens. Marcus finds John, and explains that despite his death, his systems were still operational, as Skynet always have backup systems. Even though he gave his heart, he was still functional, aware, but unable to move, until getting a signal from Skynet. Marcus, of course, says that he told Skynet to go fuck itself, but then it explained the situation and realized, based on what they said, that what's going on is extremely important. That's why he heeded Skynet's request and sought out John Connor. Skynet needs John Connor's help. Marcus explains that he was merely a prototype. The real test subject for Skynet's plans was Thomas Parnell, a serial killer who's taken control of Skynet's Terminators and intends to wipe everything out. John Connor decides that they need to terminate Parnell in the past to prevent all of this. But during the travel to the time displacement equipment, Connor is hindered by stuff falling on him, and thus Simon is forced to go instead, which is why we see him do what he does in the 2003 parts of this story. John Connors realizes he's failed the mission right away. He reasons that had he succeeded, the future would have instantaneously changed around them. I was always unsure that's how time travel in Terminator actually worked. The rules are a bit muddy here and unclear, but I guess that's time travel for you. It's just that I don't understand how John Connor is so sure that's how time travel in his universe works. The tension throughout the comics rises as Parnell takes more and more control of Terminators from Skynet, as well as forcing Dr. Kogan to fix him. John, meanwhile, has his first direct conversation with Skynet via Marcus Wright. After freeing Dr. Kogan from captivity, John Connor meets up with Skynet, and they discuss their final solution. John Connor is going to fuse into the body of a Terminator. It's his best chance of defeating Thomas Parnell. Dr. Kogan transfuses his body into that of a Terminator. John becomes in Terminator Ultra 5000 and takes on Parnell in the ultimate final battle. Parnell sends a Terminator to destroy John Connor's physical body, and at first it seems that he's won, until Connor reboots his power and impales Parnell with his fist. You are terminated. Thomas Parnell is defeated, and with that, everyone is saved. Now there's a comic book issue that seeks to resolve everything. To be honest, I wish Parnell's termination and the resolution to the story was in the same issue. But ignoring that, John has a final deal with Skynet. After all they've been through, and the very specific circumstances they've had to deal with, fighting against a common enemy, John says that perhaps they can both work together to rebuild the world and create peace. Fighting after this experience is a waste of time, and is not productive for either humanity or Skynet. And of course, Skynet agrees. Connor carries his physical body out, and with that, he announces the end of the war. Everybody wins. John Connor logs how, in the aftermath, Skynet sent its Terminators to help humans rebuild the world. In the epilogue, we also see the T-850 being sent through time. The comic cleverly explains that since John Connor physically died, and all he's got left is a robotic voice, the T-850 would never recognize it, and so they had to go with his wife's voice. I do wish the T-850 and John Connor would have a more meaningful interaction during all this, though, given the line, "We'll meet again," in Terminator 3. But anyways, after this, Connor gets some artificial skin scaped onto his Terminator model, and he reunites with his wife. Connor logs that it's been 3 years since the end of the war. Connor's genetic tissue was used to have Kate give birth to another child, a girl named after John's mother, Sarah. Humanity is out of its darkest age, and the world is once again at peace. So yeah, that was Terminator Salvation, the final battle. It's an interesting twist to have John Connor and Skynet work together in the end, but the way it was set up, it makes sense. I am fully happy to accept this 12-part comic series as the canonical sequel to Terminator Salvation and the end of this specific storyline. Terminator 3 and Salvation are not the definitive sequels to Terminator 2. There are other alternate sequels to consider, and with that being said, the story ends in a satisfactory way. Comics could largely help finish any inconclusive storylines in any movie series. I always wanted to know what happened after Terminator Salvation, and the final battle impressed me. Cool illustration, a gripping story, a meaningful continuation of Terminator 3 and Salvation, using characters from those movies, and so on and so forth. I don't really have anything to complain about at all. Well, actually, there were a few things I pointed out in the review, but aside from that, it's nice that they kept things relatively simple. Maybe it's a good thing Terminator Salvation sequels were canceled, given they had a lot of bizarre, out there ideas for the sequels, like bringing Sarah Connor back somehow. This comic is certainly well made. If this were a movie, this would probably rank number 4 in the 5-part story. I'd say Terminator 3 would come in last place for context, but I still like that film. I give Terminator Salvation, the final battle, an 8.5 out of 10. Now with this detour out of the way, I think it's time I should talk about Terminator Genesis, the failed 2015 reboot that nobody likes. I think I do have some meaningful and insightful things to say about it, though. Also, if you want more Terminator, I recently released the first parts of an unofficial audiobook of the novel Terminator 2, Infiltrator, on my second channel, Plagiarist Films, which is the first ever Terminator 2 sequel before Rise of the Machines came out. I'll leave a link in the description. I'm JJ Plagiarisms, and until next time, what are stories but mystery boxes? Under the mountain.